The October light came soft through the valley, filtering gold through the cottonwoods that lined the property like old sentinels. The farmer stood at the fence line where his land met the road, one boot propped on the lower rail, his hat pulled low against the slanting sun. The felt was worn smooth in places, shaped by years of weather and work, comfortable as an old prayer. He wasn't a man who gave much thought to appearances. The land didn't care what you wore when you walked it at dawn, when you checked the irrigation lines or mended fence in the early cold. The land only asked for presence, for attention, for the kind of quiet respect that came from knowing you were temporary and it was not. But tonight was different. Tonight, there was the gala. He'd received the invitation 3 weeks prior, delivered by courier in a cream envelope with elegant script. The annual harvest gala at the Whitmore estate, benefiting the county's agricultural preservation fund. Black tie optional. Cocktails at 7. The farmer had almost thrown it away. He wasn't a gala man. He was a sunrise man, a coffee on the porch man, hair check the weather and plan the day man. The social circuits of the county's wealthier families moved in rhythms foreign to him, full of small talk and posturing, charity auctions and champagne toasts that felt hollow against the kind of real work that left your hands calloused and your back aching. But something had made him keep the invitation. Maybe it was the memory of his late father, who'd always said a man should know both the soil and the people who walked above it. Maybe it was simple curiosity, or maybe, if he was honest with himself in the way only solitude allowed, it was because he'd been alone too long, and even a man content with his own company could feel the weight of too many silent evenings. So he'd said yes. And now, standing in his bedroom with the late sun pouring through the window, he looked at the dark suit hanging on the door and felt something close to anxiety. The jacket fit well enough. He'd had it tailored years ago for his brother's wedding, but it felt like a costume. He was far more comfortable in denim and flannel, in boots that knew every inch of his land. Still, he dressed carefully. White shirt, simple tie, the suit jacket that smelled faintly of cedar from the closet where it had hung untouched for seasons. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Clean-shaven, hair combed, the lines around his eyes perhaps a bit deeper than he remembered. But he kept his hat. It was foolish maybe, but the hat was him. Without it, he felt untethered, like a tree without roots. So he settled it on his head, the familiar weight a comfort, and headed out into the evening. The Whitmore estate sat on a rise overlooking the valley, a sprawling property of manicured lawns and old-growth oaks, with a main house that had been built in the 1920s by railroad money. White columns, wide verandas, windows that glowed amber as the sun descended. Cars lined the circular drive, luxury sedans and imported sports cars polished and perfect. The farmer parked his truck at the far end, where it looked out of place among the gleaming vehicles, and walked toward the entrance. His boots clicked on the stone pathway. Music drifted from inside, something classical and refined, underscored by the murmur of conversation and laughter. He paused at the threshold. Through the open doors he could see them, the county's elite dressed in evening gowns and tailored suits, holding crystal glasses, moving through the space with the easy confidence of people who belonged. He recognized some faces. The bank president, the owner of the largest vineyard in the region, the real estate developer who'd tried twice to buy sections of his land, and he felt quite suddenly like an imposter. But he'd come this far. He stepped inside. The foyer was grand, all polished marble and soaring ceilings, a chandelier glittering overhead like captured starlight. A young woman in black and white offered him champagne from a silver tray. He took a glass, more for something to hold than any real desire to drink it, and moved toward the main ballroom. That's when he heard it. "Good Lord, did you see that hat?" The voice came from his left, slightly behind him. Male, educated, edged with amusement. The farmer didn't turn, but he slowed his steps. Looks like someone wandered in from the fields. A woman's laugh, high and performative. How quaint. I suppose they have to let the local farmers in for appearances. This is an agricultural benefit after all. Still, there's dressing for the occasion. That hat's seen better days, probably older than the estate itself. More laughter, shared and casual, the kind that comes easy when you've never considered that the person you're discussing might hear you. The farmer felt heat rise in his chest. Not quite anger, but something close to it. He'd anticipated feeling out of place, but he hadn't expected mockery. For a moment, he considered leaving, just turning around, walking back to his truck, driving home where the land never judged him and the silence never laughed. But then he thought of his father again, of the quiet dignity with which the old man had moved through the world, never apologizing for what he was, never diminishing himself to make others comfortable. So he kept walking. The ballroom was magnificent, with tall windows draped in silk, round tables dressed in white linen, and a small orchestra on a raised platform at the far end. People clustered in groups, their conversations animated, their jewelry catching the light. Servers circulated with trays of hors d'oeuvres that looked more like art than food. The farmer found a spot near one of the windows where he could observe without being the center of attention. He sipped his champagne, it was too sweet, too delicate, and watched the room. "You look like a man considering an escape route." The voice came from beside him, soft and tinged with humor. He turned and found himself looking at a woman he didn't immediately recognize, though something in her eyes suggested intelligence and a kind of gentle perception that made him feel, oddly, seen. She was perhaps 50, with silver threading through dark hair that she wore pulled back in an elegant twist. Her dress was simple but beautiful, deep blue like twilight, and she held her champagne glass with the kind of ease that spoke of someone comfortable in her own skin. "Is it that obvious?" he asked. "Only to someone who feels the same way." She smiled. Margaret Whitmore. The name registered slowly like tumblers in a lock clicking into place. Whitmore, the estate. This was her home. I know who you are," she said gently. "You're the farmer who owns the property down in the valley, the one who refused to sell to the developers last spring." He nodded, cautious. "That's right." "Good for you." Her eyes were warm. "That land is beautiful. It would have been a tragedy to see it carved up for subdivisions." They stood in silence for a moment, and he found it wasn't uncomfortable. She seemed content to simply be, to let the conversation find its own rhythm. "I should tell you," she said after a while, her voice quieter, "that I overheard what those people said about your hat." His jaw tightened. "You don't need to." I wanted to apologize on their behalf, though I suspect they're too wrapped up in their own importance to realize how small they sounded. She glanced at him, her expression kind. "I think it's a fine hat. It suits you." Something in his chest loosened. "Thank you. Besides," she continued, a hint of mischief in her voice, "most of the people here wouldn't last a day doing what you do. They complain if the country club runs out of imported sparkling water. I doubt they've ever checked an irrigation line at 4 in the morning or mended a fence in the rain." He found himself smiling despite everything. "You know about irrigation lines?" "My late husband was a farmer," she said simply, "before all this." She gestured at the grandeur around them, before the money and the estate and the obligations that come with old wealth. "He grew up working cattle in Montana. We met when I was teaching school in Billings. He was the best man I ever knew." The past tense hung in the air between them. "I'm sorry," the farmer said. "Thank you." Her smile was soft, touched with old grief that had settled into something like peace. "It's been 5 years now. Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like another lifetime entirely." He understood that. Time had a strange quality after loss, elastic and unpredictable. "This estate," Margaret continued, "was his family's. We moved here when his father passed, and he spent the rest of his life trying to balance the responsibilities of the legacy with the man he actually was. It wasn't always easy for him." She paused. "I think he would have liked you." "Why's that?" "Because you didn't sell. Because you kept the land intact. He always believed that some things shouldn't be measured in profit margins." She looked out the window toward the darkening valley. "He believed the land itself had a kind of soul, and that we were just its temporary caretakers." "I believe that too," the farmer said quietly. She turned back to him, and in her eyes he saw recognition, the kind that passes between people who understand something fundamental about each other without needing to explain. "Would you like to meet some people who might actually interest you?" she asked. There are a few here tonight who aren't quite so concerned with appearances. He hesitated, then nodded. I'd appreciate that. Margaret moved through the room with a quiet authority, and people parted naturally to let her pass. She introduced him to a woman who ran an organic farm cooperative, to a man who was working on water conservation projects in the region, to a couple who'd converted their property to native prairie restoration. These were people who knew the land, who spoke its language, and the farmer found himself relaxing into the conversations, his champagne forgotten on a nearby table. But he remained aware too of the glances from others in the room, the whispers that hadn't entirely stopped, the way certain groups seemed to find him amusing, an oddity in their carefully curated world, and he noticed how Margaret noticed, how her expression would tighten almost imperceptibly when she caught the edge of someone's mockery. As the evening deepened and dinner was served, the farmer found himself seated at Margaret's table. Along with the conservationists and farmers she'd introduced him to, the conversation was rich, full of ideas and passion, the kind of talk that mattered beyond the walls of this grand room. But across the ballroom, at a table full of developers and their perfectly coiffed partners, he caught the occasional pointed look, the raised eyebrow, the smirk behind a raised wine glass. He tried to ignore it. After dinner, the orchestra began to play something slower, more intimate, and couples moved onto the dance floor. The farmer watched them, feeling again that sense of displacement, of being a visitor in a world that wasn't his. Margaret had excused herself to greet other guests, and he found himself alone at the table, considering whether it was time to leave. He'd stayed longer than he'd expected, had enjoyed parts of the evening more than he'd imagined possible, but the weight of being observed, of being judged, was beginning to wear on him. He was about to stand when Margaret appeared beside him again. She'd removed her shoes, he noticed, and was holding them in one hand. "I've done my duty as hostess," she said. "I've smiled until my face hurts and made small talk until I could scream, and now I'd like to do something I actually want to do." He looked up at her, curious. "Would you dance with me?" she asked. The question caught him completely off guard. "I'm not much of a dancer. Neither am I, to be honest, but I'd like to try." Her expression was open, genuine. "If you're willing." He thought about refusing, about explaining that he'd already stayed longer than planned, that he should get back to the farm, that he had early responsibilities. But something in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't pity. It wasn't charity. It was simply an invitation offered freely without expectation, and he realized quite suddenly that he didn't want to refuse. He stood, taller than she was even without her heels, and offered his hand. She took it. They moved onto the dance floor together, and the room seemed to shift around them. Conversations paused. Heads turned. The mockery that had been subtle before became suddenly sharp, focused. Because everyone in that room knew who Margaret Whitmore was, and many of them had just spent the evening dismissing the man she was now holding close, her hand in his, her other hand resting on his shoulder. The farmer could feel the weight of attention, but Margaret seemed entirely unbothered. She looked up at him with those kind, knowing eyes and smiled. "Just follow my lead," she said softly, "or I'll follow yours, whichever works." They began to move, neither of them particularly graceful, but there was something honest in the way they navigated the music together. No performance, no pretense, just two people finding a rhythm that was their own. "You know," Margaret said after a moment, "everyone's staring. I noticed. Does it bother you?" He considered the question. A few hours ago, it would have. But now, with her hand in his and the music playing softly around them, he found that it didn't matter quite so much. Not as much as it should, he admitted. She laughed, quiet and genuine. "Good, because I stopped caring what these people thought a long time ago. Then why host the gala? Because some traditions are worth keeping, even if they come with complications, and because the cause matters. But that doesn't mean I have to perform the way they expect." She met his eyes. "Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is simply be yourself." They danced in silence for a while, and gradually the room's attention began to diffuse. Other couples joined them on the floor. The music swelled and softened. The evening continued around them. But something had shifted. The farmer could feel it in the way certain people approached Margaret afterward, more careful now, more respectful. In the way conversations that had been casually cruel earlier now faltered when he passed by. In the way the woman who'd laughed at his hat now avoided his gaze entirely, because they understood finally what he hadn't known himself, that Margaret Whitmore didn't just own the estate where they were celebrating. She owned half the valley. And the farmer's land, the land they'd mocked him for refusing to sell, the land they'd dismissed as quaint and insignificant, that land bordered hers. That land was part of a larger preservation effort she'd been quietly funding for years. That land mattered to her in ways that went far beyond property value or development potential. And by dancing with him, by choosing him publicly in front of all of them, she'd made a statement they couldn't ignore. Later, when the evening had wound down and most of the guests had departed, the farmer found Margaret on the veranda looking out over the valley. The moon was high now, full and bright, casting silver across the landscape. "Thank you," he said, joining her at the railing. "For what?" "For the dance, for the company, for making me feel less like an outsider." She smiled. "You were never an outsider. They were just too small-minded to see it." They stood in comfortable silence and he felt something settle in him, something he hadn't realized was unsettled. A sense of belonging, maybe, or recognition. The understanding that dignity didn't come from how you dressed or where you stood in the social hierarchy, but from how you moved through the world, from what you protected and what you refused to compromise. "I meant what I said earlier," Margaret said after a while, "about my husband. He would have liked you. I wish I could have met him." "So do I." She turned to look at him, and her expression was gentle but clear. "He used to say that the land chooses its people as much as people choose the land, that there's a kind of calling to it for those who can hear it." "I believe that," the farmer said. "I know you do. I can see it in the way you talk about your property, in the way you refuse to sell even when the offers were substantial." She paused. "There aren't many people left who understand that." "There are enough," he said. "I met several tonight." "Thanks to you." "Thanks to you," he corrected gently. She laughed. "Maybe we both deserve credit." He smiled, and it felt easy, natural, like something he'd forgotten how to do and was only now remembering. "What will you do now?" Margaret asked. "After tonight. Go home, check the irrigation, make coffee at dawn." He shrugged. "Same as always." "That sounds perfect. What about you?" "Same. Though I'll sleep in a bit later than dawn, I think. And I'll probably spend tomorrow avoiding phone calls from people trying to apologize for being terrible." She grinned, one of the few perks of being the hostess. They talked for a while longer. About the land, about the seasons, about the way the valley changed from month to month. Easy conversation, the kind that didn't require performance or cleverness, just presence. And when he finally said goodnight and walked to his truck, his worn hat still on his head, he felt lighter than he had in a long time. The weeks that followed were quieter, but different somehow. Margaret called a few times, ostensibly to discuss the conservation initiatives they'd talked about at the gala, but their conversations wandered easily into other territories. Books they'd read, places they'd traveled, memories of people they'd lost. She visited his property once, walking the fence lines with him in the early morning cold, her breath misting in the air, her eyes taking in the land with the kind of appreciation that couldn't be faked. "It's beautiful," she said simply, standing on a rise that overlooked the entire spread. "No wonder you wouldn't sell." "It's home," he said, and she nodded, like she understood exactly what he meant. They weren't courting exactly. Neither of them had the energy or inclination for anything dramatic or rushed. But something was growing between them, slow and steady, like the roots of the old cottonwoods that had stood for generations. Something built on recognition and respect, on shared values and comfortable silence. The farmer found himself looking forward to her calls, to her visits, to the way she moved through his space without trying to change it. She brought coffee once, good coffee from a place she liked in town, and they sat on his porch watching the sunrise, not needing to talk, just being. And gradually, he realized he wasn't lonely anymore, not in the way he had been. Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in mid-November, dusting the valley in white. The farmer woke before dawn as always, made his coffee, and stepped out onto the porch to find the world transformed. Everything quiet, everything clean, the land sleeping under its blanket of cold. His phone rang just as the sun began to crest the mountains. Margaret. "Are you awake?" she asked. "Always." "Good. Look out your front window." He walked inside and looked. There, coming up his drive, was Margaret's truck, moving slowly through the snow, headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. He smiled and went to meet her. She climbed out, bundled in a wool coat and boots, her breath visible in the cold air, her eyes bright with something that looked like mischief. "I brought breakfast," she said, holding up a bag from the bakery in town. "I figured you could use the company. You drove all the way out here in the snow? I have good tires and I wanted to see how your land looks in winter." She paused. "Is that okay?" He realized, standing there in the cold morning with snow beginning to fall again around them, that it was more than okay. It was exactly what he wanted. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make fresh coffee." They spent the morning together, eating pastries at his kitchen table, talking about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. She told him about her plans for the estate, about wanting to open more of it to conservation easements, about possibly starting an educational program for young farmers. He told her about his own plans for the spring, about crop rotation and water management, about the small ways he was trying to make his practices more sustainable. And somewhere in the middle of it all, somewhere between the coffee and the conversation and the quiet snow falling outside, something shifted. She reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm glad I met you," she said simply. "I'm glad you asked me to dance. Best decision I made all year." She smiled. "Even if I was completely terrified." "You didn't seem terrified. I'm a good actor, but I was. I kept thinking you'd say no, that I'd embarrassed myself, that I'd misread everything." She squeezed his hand gently. "I'm very glad I was wrong." He turned her hand over in his, looking at the lines of her palm, the evidence of a life fully lived. "I'm not used to this," he admitted, "to having someone, to wanting someone around." "Neither am I, not anymore." Her voice was soft. "But I think we're both old enough to know that some things are worth the risk of discomfort. Like showing up on a snowy morning with pastries?" "Exactly like that." They laughed and the sound filled his small kitchen with warmth. The rest of the winter unfolded in a series of small moments that accumulated into something larger than their parts. Margaret coming to help him feed the cattle when the cold snap hit. The farmer driving to the estate when a pipe burst and she needed someone who actually knew how to fix things. Dinners at her place. Simple meals cooked together in her enormous kitchen. So different from the gala, but infinitely more real. Nights at his place, talking by the fire he'd built in the old stone hearth, their shoulders touching, the world reduced to the circle of warmth and light. They moved carefully with each other, respecting the ghosts they both carried, the losses that had shaped them, but they moved forward too, choosing presence over absence, connection over solitude. And by the time spring arrived, melting the snow and bringing the first green shoots back to the land, something had settled between them. Not certainty exactly, but a kind of rightness, a recognition that whatever they were building together was worth the careful attention they were giving it. One evening in early April, with the valley bursting into bloom and the air soft with the promise of longer days, Margaret asked him to walk with her through her property. They followed old trails through the oak groves, past meadows where wildflowers were beginning to show their colors, up to a ridge that overlooked everything. "I've been thinking," she said as they stood watching the sun descend, "about the future, about what I want the rest of my life to look like." He waited, giving her space to find her words. "I spent so many years managing this estate, fulfilling obligations, doing what was expected, and I don't regret it exactly. But I'm tired of living for other people's expectations." She turned to face him. "I want to live for what matters to me, for what feels real." "What does that mean?" "It means conservation. It means protecting the land. It means working with people who actually care, not just throwing money at problems." She paused. "It means spending time with someone who understands what that work means. Someone who doesn't need me to be anything other than what I am. He felt his heart beating steadily in his chest. That sounds like a good life. It does, doesn't it? She smiled, and there was vulnerability in her expression that he hadn't seen before. I'd like you to be part of it, if you want to be. He looked at her, this woman who'd chosen him across a crowded ballroom, who'd stood beside him when others mocked, who'd seen him for exactly what he was and decided that was enough. More than enough. I'd like that, he said quietly. Very much. She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and they watched the sun disappear behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. And the farmer felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt home. Not just in the land, though that was part of it, but in the presence of another person. In the quiet understanding that he wasn't alone anymore, that he'd found someone who walked beside him rather than trying to lead or follow. Someone who respected his silences and valued his words. Someone who saw the man beneath the worn hat and decided he was worth knowing. The months turned into seasons, and the seasons into years. They never married, never felt the need for official declarations or ceremonies. What they had was bigger than paperwork, more binding than vows. It was built on morning coffee and shared work, on hard conversations and easy laughter, on the accumulation of 1,000 small decisions to show up for each other. Margaret spent more time at his place than her own, finding peace in the simplicity of it, in the way the days followed the rhythms of the land rather than social obligations. And he found himself at the estate more often too, helping with the conservation programs she'd started, watching young farmers learn practices that honored both tradition and innovation. Together, they protected more land than either could have alone. Together, they built something that would outlast them both. And sometimes on quiet evenings, they'd talk about that night at the gala, about the people who'd mocked his hat, about the dance that had changed everything, about the way life could surprise you if you were brave enough to stay open to it. "Do you still have that hat?" Margaret asked once years later, as they sat on his porch watching a summer storm roll across the valley. "Of course." "Good. Don't ever get rid of it." "Why's that?" She smiled, taking his hand in hers. "Because it brought you to me. And that's the best thing that ever happened to either of us." He squeezed her hand gently, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the rain. The farmer was older now, his hair more silver than brown, his movements a bit slower but no less purposeful. The land had been good to him, and he'd been good to the land. The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would. But he wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. Some mornings, when he woke before dawn and stepped out onto the porch, Margaret would be there already, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over property that belonged to both of them, now in all the ways that mattered. And he'd stand beside her, their shoulders touching, and feel the kind of gratitude that came from knowing you'd been given more than you'd ever expected, more than you'd ever deserved. The land had chosen him all those years ago, and then Margaret had chosen him too, and he'd chosen her back. And in that exchange of choices, in that quiet recognition of worth and value and belonging, he'd found something he'd long ago stopped looking for. He'd found love, the mature kind, the steady kind, the kind that didn't need drama or grand gestures, but thrived in daily presence and shared purpose. He'd found partnership, the kind built on respect and admiration, on recognizing strength in another person and wanting to support rather than diminish it. He'd found home, not just in the acres he walked every day, but in the person who walked them with him. And when people asked him about that night at the gala, and they did sometimes, in town or at agricultural meetings or community gatherings, he'd just smile and say that sometimes the best things in life start with being exactly who you are, even when the world tells you that's not enough. Because it is enough. You are enough. And somewhere out there in a crowded room or a quiet moment or a place you least expect, someone is going to see you, really see you, and recognize something true. And if you're brave enough to say yes to that recognition, to accept the invitation, to dance even when you're not sure of the steps, well, that's when the real story begins. What did you think of this story? Would you have had the courage to keep your hat and dance with the widow? Leave your sincere thoughts below, and if you enjoy these cinematic, heartfelt stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your presence here means the world.